Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this, which is our final webinar as part of a series of webinars and other knowledge exchange events that we've been running as part of the TreE PlaNat project for the past couple of years. I'm Elisa Fuentes Montemayor. I'm a senior lecturer in applied ecology at the University of Stirling, and I lead the TreE PlaNat project, which is an interdisciplinary collaboration between academics and practitioners, and we're funded by the UKRI Future of UK Treescapes program. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to share with you some of the outcomes from our project. But before we do that, I'm just going to start by giving a brief introduction to the topic of natural colonisation. So landscape scale restoration is widely regarded as one of the key actions to mitigate the ecological crisis. And to achieve these, the UK, as many other countries, has very ambitious woodland expansion targets. And historically, woodland expansion in the UK has mainly taken place through tree planting. But there are many challenges of scaling up tree planting to the levels that are required to meet those targets. And I'll briefly mention some of those later on. But the realization of some of those challenges has led to a renewed interest in using natural processes to complement tree planting and potentially unlock woodland expansion at scale. But these tree planting and natural colonisation are, of course, very different approaches with potentially very different outcomes and likely to be used by different kinds of land managers for different objectives. And there's a very large need for evidence to understand when, where, and for whom natural colonisation can be used as an approach to establish woodlands. Woodland creation can be achieved through a range of approaches along a continuum from active to more passive approaches. And most commonly in the UK, we tend to actively plant trees. And some of the ecological outcomes of creating woodland through planting trees have been relatively well studied. So, for example, there has been some research on the decision-making process of certain kinds of land managers to understand why they do or don't engage with woodland creation through tree planting. And in terms of ecological outcomes, ourselves and others have investigated habitat development, soil quality, and biodiversity responses to woodland creation through tree planting. And one of the main findings of previous work that we have carried out has been that structural complexity is a key determinant of the biodiversity value of woodland creation. At the other end of the spectrum, we have woodland creation through more passive approaches, such as enabling trees to colonize new areas naturally. And I'll refer to these as natural colonisation from now on. Here too, there has been some recent research into the factors influencing the establishment rates, tree density across space and time, and the structural attributes of naturally colonized woodland. But given that natural colonization is not a very common approach in the UK, this work has been on a limited set of sites, and there are still many knowledge gaps remaining. This slide is just a crude attempt at summarizing some of the predicted benefits and challenges of tree planting and natural colonization. So tree planting is perceived to be a quicker and more reliable method to establish woodland, but it relies on having sufficient nursery stock, which, if not locally sourced, may lead to risks of importing pests and diseases. It may also not be genetically diverse or locally adapted, leading to low resilience. Tree planting also often results in a uniform habitat structure, which, as I mentioned before, is likely to result in lower biodiversity value. On the other hand, natural colonization does not rely on planting stock, and because it relies on natural selection processes, is likely to lead to better adapted and more resilient woodlands. It also tends to lead to a patchier and more diverse habitat structure, likely to result in higher biodiversity benefits. But the outcomes of natural colonization are highly context dependent and strongly influenced by factors such as proximity to seed sources, herbivory pressure, and other site conditions. So given the likely differing outcomes and the inherent challenges of these two methods, we have become very interested in hybrid approaches that combine the two methods through, for example, low-density planting or cluster planting to kickstart woodland creation. And this is what has given rise to the TreE PlaNat project, which aims to assess stakeholder perceptions of woodland expansion approaches that incorporate natural colonization, quantify the ecological consequences of woodland expansion approaches that span the planting to natural colonization continuum, and synthesize knowledge and demonstrate how tree planting and natural colonization can be used in hybrid or complementary ways to scale up woodland expansion for a range of objectives. So for the rest of the webinar, we'll hear first from Bianca about understanding perceptions of land managers towards woodland creation methods along the planting to natural colonization continuum, and exploring how these vary with land manager objectives, socioeconomic and ecological context. We'll then hear from Laura and Sam about how we've been quantifying some of the ecological outcomes of these woodland creation approaches, for example, through measuring habitat structure, biodiversity, and ecological function. And later we'll hear from Susanna and Vanessa, who will share how we have been synthesizing this socio-ecological knowledge and working with practitioners to co-create outputs to inform woodland creation strategies. So now I'm going to hand over to Bianca to tell us about some of the perceptions and trade-offs.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. Afternoon, everybody. So yes, I'm Bianca Ambrosogi. I work at Forest Research, where I head up the social scientists, and I contributed to this piece of work looking at land managers' perceptions and trade-offs. Next, please. We did 3 main pieces of work in this work package. We started off with expert interviews, so we checked in with experts to try and understand what their opinions were and where we should actually be taking our research. We then undertook a national survey, and when that survey was complete, we did some follow-up interviews with land and woodland managers to delve into some of the findings from the survey in a bit more depth. And I'm just going to give you some highlights that came through from the national survey results and from those follow-up interviews to give you some of the key messages from that work. Next, please. So the national survey, just to let you know a little bit about what that did, we had 17 quantitative questions there, which were asking land and woodland managers to make decisions about how they might use the different approaches to increasing woodland cover. We used a market survey company to help us fulfill a quota sample. So we were looking for a representative number of different kinds of land managers and woodland managers that were representative of the sector as a whole. The survey opened in November 2023, and it opened right the way through until end of February 2024, so that we could actually get the numbers that we were looking for. And we did the work across the 3 nations of Great Britain. So we had representatives from England, Scotland and Wales. And on the right-hand side here, we're just showing you the breakdown of the kinds of objectives that the people who took part in the research had. So we've got a large section there who were thinking about their answers in terms of their productive objectives, that was where they were coming from. We've got others with more conservation-oriented objectives and some thinking about public amenity, public access objectives. Next, please. So one big takeaway message when we asked about preferred approaches to increasing woodland cover was this big purple segment in the pie chart. What came through really, really clearly from land and woodland managers is that when they're thinking about what approaches they might use, it's not either one thing or another thing. It's actually looking at their land holdings and seeing that there's a place for a mix of different approaches. So that was quite a surprise. That people were balancing things up and having quite a nuanced approach in understanding what they might use where. And the other interesting thing here is this green segment, where many people thought that hybrid approaches perhaps were the better approach. And that was something, again, that we didn't necessarily expect at the beginning of the research. So those are key messages there. There's not a polarization between tree planting is good and natural processes are good. We've got people recognizing that all approaches have merit depending on what kind of land holding you have and what you're trying to achieve. Next, please. So through those 17 questions in the survey, we then asked the respondents to think hard about what approaches they might use for specific factors or specific objectives. So what this quite complicated diagram is trying to show here, so each of the colours in the middle there, the sort of radar shapes, each colour represents those different kinds of land managers, woodland managers and their objectives. So the red colour there are productive people, those who have amenity and public access objectives are the orange, and so on and so forth. And what we're looking at in terms of the scale, the closer you are to the middle, the greater the score the respondents were giving for tree planting. And the further you are out to the edge, the greater the score respondents are giving to natural colonisation as an approach. So scores sort of in the middle, around 2.5, are really indicating hybrid approaches are preferred. So if you look around that particular radar diagram, you can see that peak at the bottom around enhancing biodiversity. People are really thinking in this survey that natural colonisation has a lot to offer, and they would be thinking about using natural colonisation to enhance biodiversity. But if you look at the producing timber segment, people are much, much closer towards the 0 score. So they're really thinking that tree planting, if you've got that objective, is going to be the better approach. Next, please. So across all those different questions that we asked them, this is a sort of summary table. I haven't chosen to quantify it because we're still in the middle of finishing that piece of analysis. But this is the kind of comparison across the 3 different approaches that Elisa introduced to you: tree planting, natural colonisation, or the hybrid, the mix. These are the kinds of benefits and decisions, outputs that land managers and woodland managers were using to make their decisions. So you can see where tree planting scores highly. So there was a strong thought here that if you're thinking about carbon sequestration, tree planting is really a very positive approach. But also tree planting gets a red score here for visual impact. So if you're planting things in rows and you have lots of plastic tree tubes, generally speaking, the public don't like it and it doesn't look very nice. Perhaps what you can take away from this table as well is, again, that hybrid approaches have got many, many green smiley faces and many orange, not too bad faces, and nothing sort of really showing red. So again, people are recognising the value of hybrid approaches to cover a multitude of benefits. Next, please. We also asked about people's confidence and understanding of these different approaches, and the figures at the top there are showing us that of those people that answered the survey, 80% said that they really knew what tree planting was about. 63% said they had some kind of confidence that they understood what natural colonisation was about, but quite low there for hybrid approaches. About half the people answering the survey thought they might know what hybrid approaches were about. And don't propose to go into the detail of the 2 charts, but the brown colour is showing where the knowledge gaps were in people's responses. So they're really here talking about risks, I guess, because they're wondering about how long it would take for natural colonisation to establish. How do they manage the risks around deer and other pests that might be threatening positive outcomes from that approach? And when we're looking at hybrid approaches, the message really coming through from here is they need to know a little bit more in general terms about what hybrid approaches are, and it's very much about the techniques. How do you actually do it? What does the cluster planting mean? What does the low density planting mean? How do you choose the species and so on? Next, please. So then we did the follow-up interviews, as I said, to dive into some of the patterns that were coming through from the survey. Just to say that we had 35 follow-up interviews, and here you can just see we've got 56% of those came from a sort of productive background, 38 from conservation background, and fewer from a public amenity background. And we were asking them really what they thought of the results that we thought were interesting, and whether or not this reflected their experience, and any further detail they could give us on why we were seeing those patterns in the national survey. Next, please. And really the key messages here, I guess, is what we've got in this quite complicated diagram. If you look right over to the left-hand side, we've got those approaches along that sliding spectrum that Elisa introduced in her slides. And then really what people were saying to us is that if you then look down the objectives column, if you're looking at the tree planting, the kinds of objectives that you can get some certainty around, so where the risk is less, is really that with tree planting, it's all about stand density and species mixture. You know what you're planting, you know what you're getting. And then when you're looking at the natural colonisation that's been augmented with low density planting or cluster planting, people are thinking the main sort of objectives and the main benefits there are around resilience. It's around certainty of biodiversity being incorporated into the outcomes. And it's also got something to do with the well-being of land managers and others. So this is, you know, what the land looks like and what the land is offering and what the land looks like going into the future. And then interestingly, down the bottom there, those sort of passive natural colonisation approaches, people were seeing that, you know, maybe if you've got objectives around what do I do with a difficult patch of land, maybe this is where natural colonisation has got real benefits, because you can allow natural processes to bring in that tree cover for you. And there's some quotes there on the right from people there, the kinds of words that we were using to synthesise what we thought the overall messages were. So next then, Elisa. So I think that we also just checked in on our key messages. So again, all of those interviewees said that all of the approaches are important. It depends on what your the potential of your land is, and in terms of thinking about the targets that the 3 nations of Great Britain have, you'll need to use a sort of mixed approach. There was a little bit of discrepancy in the interviews around public opinion and how much public opinion was for natural colonisation, because it can look messy and so on. And respondents definitely said that they had little information about natural colonisation and even less about hybrid approaches. So again, reinforcing what we found in the survey. And I think that's me finished, Elisa.
Right, so hi everyone, my name is Laura Brownholtz, and myself and Sam are going to be talking through some of the results of our field work to understand the ecological outcomes of treescape expansion through planting and natural colonisation. Next slide, please, Lisa. So the purpose of the surveys that we were carrying out all last summer were basically to get an understanding of how the way woodland is established influences its structure, its biodiversity, and its ecological function. Next slide, please. So to do this, we selected 28 broadleaf or mixed broadleaf woodland sites across England. All of our sites were relatively young, between 13 to 43 years since establishment, and a sort of range of sizes. They'd all previously been used for arable or improved grassland, and we ensured that all of the woodlands were adjacent or in close proximity to established woodland, knowing that that can influence particularly natural colonisation as an establishment method. Next slide, please. So across these woodlands, we spent basically the whole of summer carrying out a number of surveys to really get an idea of the structure of the woodlands, using sort of ground-based survey methods, measuring and counting trees, using LiDAR drone surveys to get a sort of wider picture of what was happening at the woodland sites. We undertook a number of biodiversity surveys looking at things like ground flora, moth trapping. We used acoustic recorders, as shown in the top right-hand photos, the audio moths, to record both audible and ultrasound to get an idea about the bird and the bat species using these woodlands. And we also put out camera traps to look at the ground-based mammals. And then in terms of the ecosystem function, we looked at sort of three main aspects. One of those was using a caterpillar predation experiment. That's what the far left bottom image is, showing one of our plasticine caterpillars, to look at sort of the predation of insects by birds and other predators. We also looked at the amount of leaf damage caused by insects across the woodlands, and we also looked at herbivore browsing damage, obviously that being quite an important influence on woodland establishment. Next slide, please. So these are just some images from our woodlands, getting an idea of what they look like on the ground and from above. And on the next slide, I'll hand over to Sam to talk about how we actually quantified that.
Yeah, next slide, please, Lisa. Yeah, so yeah, I'm Sam. I came in on this project to help with some of the LiDAR analysis that from the drone surveys that Laura and Tiago collected last summer, I guess it was now. So yeah, from the LiDAR surveys, we ended up with these high density point clouds for all of our sites, as exampled here. These ones have been superimposed with the color that the LiDAR, the drone was also able to collect. And I guess generally speaking, the planted sites had taller, larger trees that were more homogeneously distributed across the site, where the naturally colonized sites were often more patchier, with a lot more variation through space. And then the hybrid sites offered an intermediary between these two extremes, as you maybe expect. And we're going to unpick that in a bit more formal detail in the next slide. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this quite slowly and simply, so as not to overwhelm everyone with too much information. But on the x-axis for all of these plots is site age. So you see this ranges from around 10 to 40 odd years since creation. The red dots and red lines are always natural colonization sites. The blue is always hybrid approach sites, and the green is always planted sites. And then each graph is corresponding to a specific LiDAR metric. For all of these metrics, we were able to compute them for the entire point cloud for each site, which is these total metrics on the left. We also gridded up each site into 5 meter resolution sort of rasters or cells, and calculated each metric except for gap fraction for each of these cells, and then took a mean across the site. And we also looked at how these metrics varied across the site looking at those cells and how much the value varied between cells. So we'll start with the top one. This is RH90, which is just a canopy height measure, basically. So it's how tall the canopy is. You can see here that the planted sites, in terms of total canopy height and the mean canopy height across the site, is just always higher than naturally colonized and hybrid approaches. But you see in the CV RH90, so how much canopy height varies, it varies more across the site in the naturally colonized sites. Now, foliage height diversity is a measure of how evenly foliage is spread through the canopy from top to bottom, split up into height bins. The interesting thing to look at here is that all sites have a high foliage height diversity when you're taking into account the entire point cloud. But as sites age, mean foliage height diversity increases quite quickly in planted sites, but not in naturally colonized sites. So that's if you calculate this metric across 5 meter grid cells and take the mean of it, it increases a lot in the planted sites. And we'll dig into this in the next slide to hopefully make it quite clear what this means. Skew, I guess the way to think of skew is which way the tail is of the distribution of points through height. So if you have a positive skew, it means you have a lot of ground flora, a lot of shrubs, and then a few tall trees. Whereas if you have a negative skew, all of your foliage might be distributed in the canopy, and then a very sparse understory with just a few shrubs. I guess as you'd expect, skew in absolute terms decreases through time as the canopy forms in all woodlands, but it's and the same here for mean skew. But I think what is interesting is that the variation in skew across a site increases quite a lot in naturally colonized sites, but decreases in planted sites. And again, in the next slide, I'm going to dig into what that looks like and what that means in application. And then our final metric here is gap fraction, which is basically the proportion of each site made up of gaps. And here a gap is considered any 5 meter square contiguous area where the points are below 1 meter in height. So this one's quite self-explanatory. The naturally colonized sites always have higher gap fraction than the planted sites, and the hybrid sites are a bit of an intermediary. So next slide, please, Elisa. So I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about the maybe 2 more obscure metrics and what they mean in applications. So foliage height diversity, if you remember, it's how evenly foliage is spread through the height bins. Now, if you look at A and C here, both of these have a high total foliage height diversity, because when you take the whole site into account, foliage is spread quite evenly across all height bins. The difference is A has a low mean foliage height diversity, because if you look at each cell individually, it's only got foliage in 1 height bin, whereas C has a high mean foliage height diversity because each cell individually has even foliage spread through it. So obviously these are quite extreme examples, and this isn't actually how a planted woodland looks, but this one is more akin to the planted woodland C, and A is more akin to the naturally colonized woodland, where you have variation in top height across the site. Now, variation in skew, as I said earlier, like a negative skew, if you look at E, a negative skew is all the foliage in the canopy and maybe not much foliage down on the ground story in the understory, whereas D is a more positive skew, where you have more foliage in the lower heights and not much foliage in the top height. Now, if you look at F, this is an example of how skew can vary across a site, yet maybe have an overall skew of 0 or a mean skew of 0. So F, you have certain cells where the skew is positive, certain cells where the skew is negative, and if you remember naturally colonized sites, this is what happens in them. They have quite a lot of variation in skew. So it really just builds into the evidence of the naturally colonized sites just being more variable across space, vertically across space, whereas the planted sites might have more evenly distributed foliage horizontally in each sort of grid cell we're looking at. It's the vertical variation that really defines the naturally colonized sites. So yes, next slide, please, Elisa. I think it's back to Laura now.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so just delving into a little bit some of the ground-based measurements of the trees that we took. So we found actually tree species richness was similar across woodland establishment method. However, there was a sort of a variation in how much certain species dominated sites. If you look, for instance, at the willow in naturally colonized sites, they quite often tended to dominate the sites, but that varied sort of within woodland creation method as well as between woodland creation methods. Next slide, please, Elisa. And then moving on to some of our sort of biodiversity metrics that we're looking at. So we found that ground flora species richness was higher in hybrid sites. Sorry, it also uses mixed sites, but the two are interchangeable. So the hybrid sites had a higher species richness of ground flora, and when we had a look at the sort of community composition, we found that there was no sort of stark difference in the community between those sites, woodland establishment methods rather, sorry. And also if we were looking at woodland specialists versus woodland generalist species, there was no significant difference between those sort of habitat affinities between the woodland establishment methods. And a similar story was found for our moth species. If I could have the next slide, please. Thanks, Elisa. So again, we found that the highest species richness was found in the hybrid sites. And again, that was sort of not particularly driven by very different community compositions across woodland establishment methods, and it also wasn't particularly driven by certain habitat specialists. Moving on to the next slide. Thanks, Elisa. Thank you. So for our bird species and our mammal species, we found that woodland establishment method did not influence the species richness. So there's no significant difference in those groups between woodland creation methods. Next slide, please, Elisa. Oh yeah, so that's just a marker slide we can skip. Yeah, thank you. And again, looking at the ecological functions between woodland establishment method. So our caterpillar predation experiment found that there was no significant difference in the probability of our caterpillars being predated between the woodland established method. And next slide. Thank you. Similarly, there wasn't an influence on the probability of leaves being damaged by insects either. And the final ecological function we were looking at was the mammal herbivory. So we found quite a range of sort of species richness and density of seedling and sapling stems across the woodland sites, but this wasn't particularly driven, well, it wasn't driven by woodland establishment method. Overall, we had fairly low signs of mammal herbivory across our sites. So with 15 out of our 28 sites had no evidence of herbivory at all. And we found that there was no, we had a look at our camera trap footage, or images rather, sorry, and had a look at our herbivores that were present on the camera traps, and we didn't find any influence of woodland establishment method on the numbers of herbivores that were showing up on our images, and that sort of also was reflected in the proportion of stems that were browsed. So we didn't find any influence of woodland creation method on our herbivorized seedling and sapling stems. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarize the sort of ecological outcome findings. So as Sam highlighted, we found that the natural colonized sites were patchier and sort of as we might as we had predicted, they varied more across the sites. Our planted sites had larger trees in terms of DBH and canopy height that increased more rapidly as the sites got older in comparison to hybrid and natural colonization. And this was related to the ground flora and moth species richness being higher in hybrid sites. We didn't find any influence on our bird or mammal species richness. And similarly, no influence of woodland establishment method on our ecological functions. Thank you. I think I'm handing over now.
Great, thanks, Laura. So hi, everyone. I'm Susanna Fleiss. I've been working on the knowledge exchange and synthesis element of the project, along with Vanessa Burton at Woodland Trust, who will present shortly, and Heather Gilbert at National Forest Company, who's also going to speak later. And I'm based at the University of Edinburgh with Mark Metzger. So we've been lucky in that we've had some outings in the sunshine on this project. As you can see here, we're at the National Forest on a visit to one of their natural colonisation sites. Next slide, please, Elisa. So, sorry, I've got a noisy cat who might misbehave now, we'll see. We were really fortunate in this project in that it was very well constructed before I arrived, and there was a strong knowledge exchange element built in throughout the duration of the project, which meant that from the beginning, oh dear, sorry, there were planned activities where we would provide regular blog posts and webinars, sharing our research findings. And most importantly, we set up a discussion group, which we've called our Knowledge User Board, who have met every 3 months throughout the duration of the project. And in order to for us to discuss their knowledge needs, so we can understand existing knowledge within practical and more strategic roles where people are using different methods of woodland creation. And also we've been able to bring together the knowledge needs and then try to address those where possible through the project in terms of the way we've interpreted our research and also the outputs that we've created. So we've been able to follow our plan and produce various things that we were planning to throughout the knowledge exchange programme, but we're also really pleased because these discussions with the Knowledge User Board have led to a lot of outputs that we weren't planning because of the quality of the discussions among the group and the way in which we've been able to build on the needs that they've raised amongst land managers. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please, Elisa. So some of the things that we've created through the project, which were originally planned, are that we have set up a demonstration site of natural colonisation in the National Forest. So we launched that in spring last year on the sunny day, which you saw in the picture, although that wasn't the demonstration site itself. And that site is an arable field that's being left to colonise naturally next to an existing woodland, and half of it has been planted with a low density of trees so that it will be able to show land managers what natural colonisation might look like in a similar context. And that's a nice legacy from the project. And then we've been also working very closely with the Woodland Trust. In summer, they ran a training event for land managers on initiating and managing different methods of woodland creation. And that made use of some illustrations that were commissioned. So this is one example showing a sort of early stage of natural colonisation progressing next to an existing adjacent woodland. And we've got some upcoming articles in practitioner journals. So we're due to have an article in ICF Trees magazine this spring, and the Woodland Trust supporter magazine called Broadleaf is also running a feature on our research and natural colonisation. And we'll also have a dissemination video which is upcoming. Next slide, please. So to go into a bit more detail on the Knowledge User Board, we've had roughly 18 active members. In most meetings, there are about 10 people. It's difficult to quantify because people have changed roles and things throughout the project. So they span a nice range of organisations and roles relating to woodland creation, including different governmental and public sector organisations from across Britain. Also national scale environmental NGOs, and then smaller scale regional NGOs or organisations that are focusing on expanding woodland cover within particular regions. And then we've had some land agents and forestry consultants join us, and also some farmers and representatives of farming networks. And yeah, we've been delighted with the way that the group has run. We've had some really interesting discussions every time we've met, and it's been very insightful. So next slide, please. So, sorry, I'm distracted by my cat actually. During the KEB, I'm now going to go through some of the because of the discussions that we held. So the first of these is that they raised a key knowledge need as being a lack of case studies and examples of natural colonisation in Britain. And that was raised quite early on in the project. So we were able to address that knowledge need, and we created an initial set of collated an initial set of 5 case studies, which are up on our website, and have now been able to expand that to 15, which are not yet available, but we will make them available shortly. And we've been able to include those across quite a spread of sites across the UK, across Britain, including upland and lowland, and some of these examples have actually been unsuccessful, which was something that people highlighted as being really important in terms of sharing what may or may not work. Next slide, please. And then another key knowledge gap that came up was that there were lots of questions on around the ecological process of natural colonisation and exactly how to work with that as a land manager to adaptively respond to certain processes that you may or may not be seeing. So we decided to run a workshop where we worked together to generate a set of FAQs on natural colonisation. And these are just currently being prepared with the Woodland Trust team, and will be available shortly for land managers and policymakers. So again, we hope that these and the case studies will prove to be really useful resources for people in more practical or strategic roles. And then we were also able to decide on webinar topics and blogs. Sorry, he's really naughty, isn't he? That that related to knowledge needs raised by the Knowledge User Board again. So we ran a webinar where we brought together 10 experts from across Britain to address in more detail what we know currently about the ecology of natural colonisation. And that was actually the point at which we realised we had so much existing knowledge amongst our Knowledge User Board and amongst this network of experts and the existing project team that we've brought together these case studies into a practitioner's perspective paper, which is currently in review. So that's really a fantastic outcome from the project. You know, that wasn't something we were expecting. Next slide, please.
You're handing over to me now.
Thanks for the comments on that. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Great. I can turn the cat off.
Thanks, Susanna. Great cameo from Marmalade the cat there. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Vanessa Burton. So I'm a conservation advisor at the Woodland Trust, and yeah, I've been part of the knowledge exchange bit of the project mainly. So yeah, like Susanna was saying, we've had a few really nice outputs that we weren't planning on doing, but that have come from those really great discussions with the Knowledge User Board. So just a couple here. I think Susanna mentioned the monitoring protocol already, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few slides, but it basically kind of came up in discussions in the KUB and also at the training event that it might be something that would be really useful. And yeah, as Susanna said, we've had the training event that we ran in August in the National Forest. And it was basically, to kind of find a different way to disseminate some of the latest research from TreE PlaNat, enable practitioners and advisors to come together, share their knowledge about these topics as well. And yeah, we covered things like species choice and methods for given design. We did a site visit to a kind of potential creation site and talked about how to assess the site for method choice. And we discussed possible management interventions as well. So yeah, loads of sharing of knowledge and experience. And yeah, we're going to be running more of those in May this year in collaboration with Natural England. So I think I'll share more details about that in a couple of slides as well. Next slide, please, Elisa. Yeah, so the FAQs that Susanna mentioned, yeah, they were basically a kind of initial suggestion from the Knowledge User Board of being like, yeah, can we kind of collate existing knowledge of these things that we might want answers to? So we kind of, road tested them at that demonstration event that Susanna mentioned. We had a workshop with members of the Knowledge User Board and kind of got their input. And then we've also integrated knowledge from the latest research and case studies. And so we're going to have these set of 13 FAQs, which are going to be available really soon. But they basically cover these 4 areas. So yeah, kind of definitions and what we know, what to expect from each method based on current evidence, how to assess sites for kind of method choice, and then a bit about kind of benefits and challenges, making the best choices for your objectives, and a few guidelines on management and monitoring as well. So yeah, keep an eye out for those. Next slide, please, Elisa. And so yeah, this is we're kind of drafting this monitoring guidance at the moment. It's something that we kind of kept coming up and we wanted to try and provide. It came up in we were writing the FAQs and comes up at the training event. And we used one of our Knowledge User Board meetings to get input to this. But what we really want to try and provide is a really simple way for land managers to monitor what's going on, especially if they try and use more natural processes. So to make it simple, but also trying to go beyond a little bit beyond something just as simple as stems per hectare. So something that can take into account structural complexity, gives you a few kind of optional options for what you can measure if you want to measure your progress against different objectives. So yeah, as I say, early days for this, we're just drafting it, but hopefully it will be available with a lot of our other outputs as well at the end of January. Yeah, next slide, please, Elisa. Yeah, so just wanted to say a little bit about the Woodland Trust's involvement with the with the project. So yeah, both us and the National Forest have been involved as project partners from the very start. And I think it's really important to highlight that that's pretty unusual, but really fantastic to have funded time for environmental charities basically to be part of research projects. And I guess as a trust, we've done natural colonisation for a long time, and then particularly since we've published our woodland creation guidance a few years ago now, but we really stress or kind of go on about the benefits of using different methods, so planting, but also natural colonisation and mixed methods. We talk about structural complexity as being really fantastic, but I guess until this point we've based that on assumed knowledge, and so the kind of chance to be part of this project and really delve into the evidence behind that, and to find that hybrid methods are coming out as this really positive thing. It's really fantastic for us, especially as we talk about striving to be an evidence-based organisation. And so yeah, hopefully, it's been great to be properly involved in the project throughout, and we're kind of going to be using the findings to inform our guidance and practice going forward. So yeah, I think hand back to Susanna for the next slide.
Great, thanks. And I can now focus. So yeah, just to reiterate that it's been really fruitful having the involvement from Woodland Trust and National Forest, whom you're about to hear from, and our networks through the Knowledge User Board, and also a project advisory group which took part throughout the duration of the project. So it's become really clear to us that there's a huge value in having continuous engagement with different stakeholders throughout an academic project. And it also seems like it was a really timely project in that there's been a really keen interest in trying to understand these different methods of woodland creation and explore the potential for using them as well as tree planting. So please see our project website for any further information, and all our previous webinars and our blog posts are available there. And we'll put this one online as well later today or this week. So we'll also make available shortly, when they're all polished and ready for sharing, our set of FAQs and monitoring protocol, and also the case studies. And briefing for policymakers that will summarise the key findings of the project, and also draw on some related projects of forest research. And yeah, finally, just to highlight that there are 2 more training events being run by the Woodland Trust in May this year, one in Yorkshire and one in Surrey. So please email conservationtraining@woodlandtrust.org.uk if you're interested, or if you can't find that contact for some reason, get in touch with any of the project team. And I'd like to just extend a very substantial thank you to all of the Knowledge User Board members who've given a huge amount to the project. And I'm now looking forward to handing over to some of them who will explain a bit about how they use natural colonisation in their organisations and their involvement in the project. Thank you.
Great. So can I ask Heather, Jenny, Matt and Claire to turn on your cameras? We're now moving over to a little panel discussion where our panelists will reflect on how they use natural colonisation in their organisations, what they've learned from being part of or shadowing the project as part of the Knowledge User Board, and also what some of their remaining challenges are for them or for their organisations in using or thinking about natural colonisation. So I'd like to start off with Heather Gilbert, who's the Research and Evidence Manager at the National Forest Company, and was actually one of our partners within the TreE PlaNat project. Heather.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'd like to start off by just echoing a couple of the things that Vanessa was just mentioning about the benefits of being fully integrated within the project. I think as a conservation organisation, we're often sort of tangentially involved with different projects, but being able to be part of the research team helped to develop the research questions and be part of the outputs, and particularly the conversations around who appropriate audiences for this work are going to be, has been a really important part for us as an organisation to make sure we're learning as we go and we're helping to shape those outputs. So it's been really helpful for us being fully integrated with the project. And particularly what that's helped us is we've now obviously got our new demonstration site that Susanna mentioned earlier, which we will be testing the new monitoring method at in the next few weeks once we've got that together. So it's able to give us kind of a test run for some of the things that are happening within the project. And bringing people to the National Forest as well as part of the training sessions and the launch event for the demonstration site allows us to talk about a bit of the wider work we're doing, as well as focusing in on the natural colonisation sort of existing sites and the new demonstration site that we have here in the forest. So we have had bits of natural colonisation happening in the National Forest for many, many years, but it's always been quite opportunistic and not necessarily fully integrated. And so what we're hoping to do as a result of some of the findings of this project is actually review, particularly in terms of the grants that we provide to landowners, how we can actually support those landowners with integrating natural colonisation into their planting designs and making that a slightly more prominent offer within our grant schemes. I think for us, the challenge will be a little bit of a culture change around going from this kind of output driven, here's the number of trees that we've put in the ground, through to here's what we're expecting to get in 10, 15, 20 years time. And I think there'll be a bit of culture change to happen there to make that integration, but being able to take the data that come out of this research project to inform those changes will really help to strengthen that process as we move forward.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Heather. And it's been wonderful having you in the project and working with you over the last 2 years. Then we'll go to Jenny Knight, who's the General Manager at Stump Up for Trees in Wales. Go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, good morning. Oh, good afternoon now, everyone. Yeah, no, it's been really great being part of the Knowledge User Board, and I don't think the benefits of having a knowledge user board like this in a big research project can be underestimated from a kind of practitioner perspective. Just the networks and the access to ongoing research gives us a lot more information about what's happening, but also access to research that in a lot of cases might still sit behind a paywall or be very, very difficult to access. It really has been a massive step forward in how projects like this are undergone. We've really enjoyed being part of it. In terms of our projects, we've always taken a hybrid approach to natural colonisation and tree planting, and we will continue to do this. I think a lot of the research has kind of supported that approach. What we would like to do then is be able again to draw on that change in how people are perceiving natural colonisation, and that's still a challenge for us in terms of the accounting and monitoring of our sites, and how we are reporting the delivery of natural colonisation over the long term. There is still, it doesn't matter how enthusiastic people are for the ecology and the getting on site, and when you talk to people supporting, there is always the question, and what were the tree numbers at the end, and it just keeps coming back to that. So I still think we're in the process of that step change of people's understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve, but also really looking forward to taking away some of the monitoring techniques that have been used and actually looking at how we can replicate that over the long term on the sites that we're delivering at the moment.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Very useful. Then we'll go to Matt North, who's the Programme Manager at South Yorkshire Woodland Partnerships and was a very active member in our KUB.
Thanks for that. So to introduce who South Yorkshire Woodland Partnership are, we are a local woodlands partnership encouraging an increase in woodland cover and tree cover in the region. We do that by working to remove the barriers, and with landowners we may start off with outline designs, help navigate regulatory processes and support access to capital and management grants for the landowners and land managers. We've used natural processes in a range of situations. We've been particularly started off using it really in peri-urban sites, which were prone to antisocial behaviour. So change over time seems to be a better way forward than sticking a load of trees in some, and certainly not with tree tubes, because it's just a target. At the same time, we've used cultivation techniques in order to break up the swards. Frequently, it's quite sort of like dominated by ryegrass or amenity grassland sward, with very little biodiversity of other sort of like grasses and forbs. And at that time, we also took the opportunity to put in wildflower seed mixes to try them out, to help with biodiversity, but also to sort of like to generate interest in the site. And we've also used interpretive techniques such as on-site signage and ex situ signage to explain what we're doing, so that the area isn't considered as abandoned. We've also used it in the development of BNG land banks, working his way backwards from the scores, so that we're looking at sort of areas of woodland and scrub that they're targeting, and looking at ways that we can generate that, incorporating the previous cultivation and diversified swards, and also looking at if it was possible to use tree seeds at the same time to help promote sort of natural regeneration. We've also in designs included nucleated planting to compensate for the lack of species that may be present in available seed rain, in order to promote the resilience of the final woodland or scrubland that we're generating. So yeah, what I've got out of it is I've explored my own experience by discussing it with other members of the CAB and workshops, and my own prejudices, and actually sort of like saying, what my assumptions are they real, and are they borne out? And that's been really useful, certainly with the development of the research. Having a clear insight into the national context, with ploughing away on a regional basis. We're not a national NGO, we're a regional one, and actually linking up and seeing how other people are approaching things is quite an eye-opener. I've got data to back up arguments with funders and landowners and people's approaches to things. So we'll talk more about that later on. And we've got another tool in the box, so that we're able to sort of like use this as a suite of tools. One size doesn't fit all, but we're able to sort of like mix and match as appropriate. And I think the challenge is going to be flexible funds post March 25 for Nature for Climate. Are those funds going to provide, are those funds going to be a risk for people that's undertaking it if we're using natural processes? Because if you planted trees, they're there, they may live or die, but natural processes take a long time. Scrub as a habitat is a great one, but the are we on a bit of a race with the 16.5% canopy cover, and efforts are sort of like steering us away from this? Also, when people are in, you know, I'm going to plant 1 million trees in a region and something like that, doesn't lend itself to this, because what we need is well-designed, resilient woodlands that's for the benefit of people and wildlife, not 1 million trees planted all at the same time, I would suggest. And convincing a wide range of stakeholders that this is a good idea, including the public. I mentioned risk for the landowners before and the grants that may be available, but it's potentially linked in with rewilding association and abandonment. Is that an issue? Some people are for it, some particularly farmers take a dim view of those sort of like nomenclature, and I think that's really been interesting to explore. So yeah, that's it for me. I think I've talked for a bit over my time.
Can listen to you for a long time, Matt, and yeah, just that wide range of experience that you already have has been really useful for the KUB. So thank you very much. And then lastly, Claire Pinches, who's agreed to step in for Emma Deere at the very last moment. That was part of our FAQ workshop and our site visit last spring. And she's a scientific analyst at Natural England. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, nice to see everybody again. And yeah, Emma sends her apologies. Unfortunately, she's unwell, but she's been a key member of the Knowledge User Board. In terms of Natural England's perspective, well, we have a team of TreE Action Plan delivery advisors who work with the Forestry Commission and with the Woodland Trust and the community forests to really explore opportunities for woodland creation and woody habitat creation in across England in the different areas, and that includes consideration, and obviously in line with nature recovery, and that includes consideration of where natural colonisation can be used and hybrid techniques can be used with it to expand tree and woodland cover. So we as an organisation are very keen to see it being used as the kind of almost default means around ancient woodland in terms of providing a longer, slower succession to woodland cover there. Because we know, as the research has shown, that basically it's got more chance of success in those locations. So that seems a natural place to enable expansion around as a halo for those sites. And of course, you know, we have it's great to see. One of the things I've kind of learned from this project is both confirmation of some existing evidence, really, that it does provide a more structurally diverse woodland or tree cover, with some of the variation in microhabitats that provides, which is really excellent. But also the other thing which I've really learned from this project is the kind of untapped appetite, perhaps, for use of this technique along, and also hybrid approaches, which will be really good to kind of see tapped into a bit more, so we can get uptake rates higher, because currently it's not widely used. It makes up a pretty low proportion of woodland establishment effort at the moment. Certainly less than 10%, I think, is what it is at the minute. So that's one thing that we've definitely learned from this. And obviously, it's been fantastic also to see the really helpful case studies and hear about the demonstration farm on the National Forest, which will be a brilliant way of encouraging people to explore how it might be used on their land. In terms of the remaining challenges, I would say I agree with Matt that one of the things that is a major challenge is the kind of fixation on certainty and speed, basically, of establishing woodland cover. And obviously that doesn't always align with a kind of longer, slower, more structurally diverse and nature-rich succession. So I think, you know, that's a key tension, and it's up to us in government and elsewhere to ensure that there's grants and incentive mechanisms to align with achieving that. And the other thing I was going to say is that I think alongside that, we perhaps need to shift our perceptions of what's realistic and actually what's nature rich over time in terms of species composition. So obviously 20 years in a woodland timescale is very, very young. And, you know, in that we're typically seeing pioneer tree species, which are basically just coming in as the front way to make room and, you know, allow establishment over time for other high canopy tree species. So sometimes when we're getting dominance by willows, that's the kind of natural stage of a woodland's development. And that in itself, those willows provide a huge benefit for pollinators. And that brings me to the other final thing I'm going to say, is that it's interesting to consider the ecological function findings of this research, but I do wonder if we also need to explore ecological functions associated with the provision of flowers provided by the trees and shrubs which develop, and the grassland resource for pollinators, and also for the provision of berries and nuts as well, and other other kind of food resources in those naturally colonized stands compared to planted woodlands, and the ecological function provided by the variation in microclimate and temperature, which could be key in providing the range of niches needed for insects, for example, and birds across their life cycles. That's all I wanted to say. And I've been a poor substitute for Emma, so I apologise for that, Mark.
It's wonderful that you could step in at the last moment, Claire, and really great to get these rich reflections from the practice and the policy side, and the continued support and enthusiasm in Natural England. And yeah, of course, this project was never able to answer all the questions, but I think some of the more practical and implementation-driven challenges and questions have been highlighted really well in the project, and some of the uncertainty around the ecological side has been reduced. I'd like to ask the whole TreE PlaNat team to now turn their cameras on again, because we'll shift over to the general Q&A. I'm really delighted to see that we still have over 100 participants here who've stayed with us for more than an hour now. So we have about 20 minutes to ask any questions to the TreE PlaNat team. I think Susanna has changed the settings so that people can raise their hand and ask the questions themselves. There's been a lot of chat going on, especially in the last few minutes whilst we had our panel discussion, and a lot of the questions in the chat I think have been answered in the chat as well, in some cases almost in little blog posts. So I'd welcome anyone who feels that their question in the chat hasn't been answered yet to raise their hand, and to just ask the questions, sort of unmute and ask them in person. Alternatively, there is the possibility to ask the questions in the chat as well. But yeah, any questions for any of the panelists? Andrew Weatherall, go ahead.
Watching this project develop quite closely and asking awkward questions at various stages on the way through. So I just want to say how much I really appreciate the work that you've done and the outreach that you've done with that. I think it's really important work, and I think you've done a fantastic job of communicating it all the stages so far. I've put some stuff in the chat about when mixed hybrid approaches should be used, and it feels like sometimes there's a let's go with the hybrid right from the outset of a project. And what I've been putting in the chat is that I'm more supportive of see how the natural colonization works and then switch to a hybrid, if it is judged to be necessary. So I just wondered where the panel, other people involved in the project, are on that. When you say hybrid or mixed, do you mean, are we talking about a grant, for example, that is specifically to take a hybrid mixed approach, or are we talking about a grant for natural colonization and then you apply for something else later on because you've judged that the natural colonization on its own isn't sufficient? I'll stop. Over to you.
Great. I think that Jenny and Matt both want to respond, and actually and Heather, so it's all from our practitioner side. I saw your hand waving before Matt put up his official hand. So Jenny, you go first, and then Matt, and then Heather.
I will just be very quick. I would say that, Andrew, ours, rather than being a grant approach, because we do our schemes on a site-by-site basis, the suitability of purely natural colonisation, whether it's mixed or whether it's planted, depends on what we see on site. So we are going on to site. When I was looking at some restoration land, the natural colonisation that was taking place is primarily Sitka spruce. And the outcome that the landowner was looking for was you were looking at sort of 100 to 200 years for other species to be able to take over the speed at which that Sitka was coming in. So a kind of identified additional seed source rather than a planted project, but by putting in an oak and birch seed source, we were then able to allow that colonisation to take place in a much more balanced way. But that would be that's it's very difficult to report on that. That would be reported on as a mixed approach. We planted a very small number of trees. It's a tricky one to balance out. If I'm planting a shelter belt, we will plant a shelter belt because we know that we're looking for a very specific structure that is delivering a purpose. But I've got a natural colonisation site that we set up this winter where the landowner wanted to plant, and we've had a look at the site and we've said, actually, there's value to that site as it is. And if you leave it, it will colonise eventually. But it will do so on the basis of the older woodlands that are surrounding it, and it will actually enable the ecology to adapt at speed. So it's very much on a case-by-case basis. However, how that appears in reporting is not going to reflect the conversation that we could have, and that's one of the difficulties, I think.
And the tailored approach will also be more difficult to think of grant schemes that work over large areas. Matt, what is your experience?
Yeah, I would say that we're fortunate to be in the Northern Forest, and we work really closely with the Woodland Trust outreach team. We're an honest broker for capital grants that may be available. We've found that the flexibility of the Grow Back Greener grant has been really useful in this approach, because you're on a case-by-case basis, as Jenny indicated. We can look at sites and say, we'll have a good guess about what might work, but also that the risk to the landowner or the grant recipient is spread as well, so that there is sort of like, if it's not working by year 5, we can look at stuff to make things working by year 10, or and so on, to facilitate that grant. And I think, and as Jenny said, it's a site-by-site basis, because you're also going to be looking at issues such as potential seed drain, sort of like, distance from those, the shape and form of the open space. Is it encapsulated or is it down one side? And similar. And having the sort of like the opportunity to sort of like cover real costs, such as cultivation or added nucleated planting, because there's nothing really apart from large seed trees or something similar, then that really makes a difference.
Great, thanks, Matt. And Heather?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of bring up something that Andrew mentioned in terms of highlighting the challenge around the word hybrid and what we actually mean by that, because obviously there's different ways that it can be determined. It's whether it's sort of low density planting and then you're letting the natural colonisation happen between that, or do you have blocks of where this section is a naturally colonised section and then you've got another area that's fully planted. And the challenge in the grant space is how do you fund all of those different things? And when you've got place-based organisations such as the National Forest, we work in a very specific area, it is much easier to have that individual support where you look at each individual site and you go and look at, okay, how can we do that? That is more of a challenge when you're looking at national grants, where maybe the capacity for going out and having that flexibility within the grant scheme is a bit more difficult. So something that we haven't really had a chance to really dig into, and this is those differences between the different types of hybrid, and therefore how you can support people through that, how you can support people through supplementary planting and things like that. I think all of that needs to be looked at within the flexibility of the grants that can be provided, but just kind of brings up that point of the difficulty in defining hybrid.
I know that in our project team, some of the ecologists are very keen to set up further projects to look at different ways of hybrid and to follow that over time. Of course, that takes time, but that's not very helpful when we're in such an urgent situation as we are right now. So it is all a bit messy. Peter Leeson, I don't know whether you have a new question or reflection on this topic, but go ahead.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of reflections and a question, actually. One is just reflecting, Matt, you mentioned about breaking up soil tops to put wildflower seeds in as you plant trees. Our experience of that through Forest to Flowers has been extremely beneficial in terms of biodiversity. So I'd really echo that as a start point. My interest really is the uplands. And I wonder if there's a sort of a thought process here about actually how we create the circumstances for woodland and allow it to be self-willed, and whether there's an element of this project about the philosophy of creating the circumstances for woodlands to exist and then to manage themselves, as it were, going forward. I think a lot of the problems in the uplands have been overgrazing. If we remove the grazing and allow trees and woodlands to become established of their own volition, is there a philosophy that drives that, or is it a very pragmatic, practical kind of grant-related kind of response?
Yeah, good philosophical question, which makes it more difficult to answer because different people in the project might have different perspectives. Matt, if you don't mind, I'll ask Elisa to reply to this philosophical question first, and then we can maybe see what others think. But do we think there is scope for a philosophical perspective on this, Elisa?
Oh, you gave me the difficult question, Mark.
You're the coordinator. It's part of the role.
I really don't have an answer for this. I was just trying to think back at some of the work that Susanna has been leading on the collection of case studies in different sort of ecological contexts and what we could learn from that. But yeah, sorry, I don't know if others want to reflect on this one, but I try and think of an appropriate answer.
Very difficult question to ask the academics who initially have been working on natural colonization, natural regeneration for a long time, but sort of have that academic hat on. But we've been working with the non-academic partners and also in the Knowledge User Board, and there were certainly a lot of more philosophical or values motivated discussions that we had there, why people were already adopting the approach. I think it's an interesting question that sort of touches on once you move beyond a purely academic project into something that is more transdisciplinary, applied, issue-driven and solution-focused rather than blue skies. And these types of questions do come in, and people may have them personally, and it may be the reason why they sit in these types of projects, but it's not spelled out explicitly. I don't know whether we do have some other reflections. I think, Matt, you were first, but Susanna also has her hand up. Maybe we'll let Susanna respond and then Matt can come in from his perspective. Susanna.
Yeah, so I think if I understood the question correctly, that yes, there has been an extremely important element of people having a philosophical approach to why they've chosen to use natural colonization in the examples that we've collected. And a lot of people actually wanted to use it because actually allowing natural processes to take place in themselves was often a key aim of the woodland creation, and seeing where it went was a point of interest. So I think that what we've also tried to do as a project is understand that as one perspective, but also then broaden the context under which natural colonization might be usable, because obviously that's only a small subset of land managers who might be interested in taking that approach.
Matt, do you want to add to that? You're still on mute, Matt. Yep.
So just from my experience, I spent a few years as lead ranger for the National Trust in the High Peak, and I was responsible for helping deliver the Clough Woodlands projects up there. We did look at natural colonisation. There had been efforts to enclose land and exclude sheep in certain areas. And 25 years later, they had the sum for a hectare might have the sum total of about 3 birch trees and a rowan. And I think that was an underappreciation of the impact of overgrazing. These sites used to be woodlands. All the names, Hollins Clough, Uden, all this sort of thing, Ashupton, indicate that it was previously wooded. But grazing has wiped out any natural regeneration. There may be a few examples of something hanging in there that may create seed rain that was far more local and genetic. There are also ground flora that's indicative of, you might expect in ancient woodland or similar, that are hiding in the shady bits away from sheep and so on. But there's just not the seed rain. And I think unless we sort of like consider real efforts to sort of like counter the impact of grazing, such as large amounts of bracken, tussocky grasses, Molinia and Nardus or similar, you need to have mob grazing in there, or some effort to change the sort of ground sward to have natural colonisation. But again, where's the seed gonna come from? Could we incorporate roosting points for birds to sit on? In order to, we've noticed that when we've ring bark trees, you've had a lot of natural regeneration underneath it. Can we encourage that? And similar. It's again going back to why isn't it wooded now, and how do we get it to be wooded, and can we use natural process to achieve this? And if it's not going to work, what can we do in its stead?
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt, and some very nice bits of advice in those last words as well. Just looking at the time, I'm going to pass back to Elisa as the project coordinator to say any last words she wants to share with us before we wind this up for today. So over to Elisa.
Thanks, Mark. Just to say, it's been wonderful to work as part of this collaborative project, working with fellow academics, but especially working with practitioners, so we can learn with them and also learn about their knowledge needs and have the avenue to implement the findings from this work. So that's been fantastic experience for me personally, and great team to work with. There's lots that we have learned over the last couple of years, but as highlighted by several people already today, there's also lots of knowledge gaps and more things to learn and investigate. So yeah, we're hoping to give continuity to this project and keep continuing to work together and learning more about natural colonization, hybrid methods, and better ways to implement this on the ground. So thanks everyone. It's also fantastic to see so many people joining this webinar and just showing interest in the topic more broadly. So hopefully this is also sort of led to a community of practitioners and people interested in the topic. So keep an eye out for more outcomes and outputs from us.